This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected, President and Vice President of the United States, each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much.
Members of Congress braved a winter storm here in Washington to certify the 2024 presidential election, solidifying the remarkable political comeback of Donald Trump. It comes 4 years after Trump promoted a campaign of misinformation, questioning the results of the 2020 presidential election that culminated with thousands of his supporters storming the Capitol, aiming to prevent the election from being certified. Back then, many Republicans denounced Trump, and the president-elect soon faced a second impeachment for inciting an insurrection. But Trump was acquitted in the U.S. Senate, and since then, Trump and Republicans have fought to reframe January 6. In just 2 weeks, Trump will be sworn back into office, promising sweeping pardons for those involved in the January 6 attack. The president-elect is coming into Washington having purged many of his Republican detractors from Congress and with ambitious plans on tax cuts, trade, immigration, and energy policy. But there are major questions about whether Trump and Republican leaders will be able to keep the party united. Joining me now is the Hill's national political reporter, Julia Manchester. Julia, this political comeback, as I said just there, is virtually complete. His supporters would say November, his election victory, is vindication. This, no matter how you put it, is a pretty amazing turn of events.
It really is. I mean, 4 years ago on this day, it felt like a lot of people were writing Donald Trump's political obituary. I mean, there were questions as to, I think at this time, whether he was going to come out and condemn those January 6th attackers at the U.S. Capitol. You had Republicans, a number of Republicans speaking out against him in that moment. But over the past 4 years, we've really seen him, reshore up that support among Republicans. We saw during the Republican presidential primary last year a number of challengers come up against him, but time after time, race after race in that primary season, we saw Donald Trump come out on top. And it wasn't only Donald Trump. I think we've seen Republicans up and down the ballot in state and federal races really reap the benefits of Trump and his policies. I think the national mood was obviously in their favor. The winds were blowing in their direction. So the question now is, can Republicans stay united? Are they united enough to implement that agenda?
Vice President Kamala Harris addressed the nation today, reflecting on the January 6th anniversary. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile, and it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles and to make sure that in America, our government always remains of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate, spoke on the Senate floor today, recounting his experience on January 6th. Back 4 years ago, you wouldn't think that Democrats would end up losing the messaging battle over January 6th, but it kind of seems like they did.
It didn't really seem to have an impact on this past election. And even, in the 2022 midterms or in the off-year elections of 2021, we saw Democrats repeatedly try to invoke it in terms of protecting democracy, protecting the nation from threats of democracy. But it didn't really hit home for Americans. A lot of Republicans during the election cycle I talked to said, it's this abstract messaging. Americans can't feel that, whereas Americans can feel, how expensive the prices of goods and services are. They can feel, or they can at least see immigration, the flow of migrants over the southern border and how that could impact, their own communities. So, Republicans say they campaigned on those more, tangible issues, and it seems to have worked out for them.
Now that the election is confirmed, Trump and Republicans are preparing to take complete control of Washington. That'll happen when Trump is inaugurated in just 2 weeks. As I said, they have a very ambitious agenda: tax cuts, immigration, energy. There's also this government funding package. Debt ceiling needs to be done with that sometime around the summer. They want to use reconciliation to pass this legislation and where they don't need Democrats in the Senate, they can't block it with a filibuster. There's this question. Originally, there was talk of having two big reconciliation bills. Over the weekend, Trump seemed to be saying, I want one big, beautiful bill. Then back today, he's like, well, one or the other, I could do with either. Is there going to be a big fight among Republicans over legislative strategy before we even get to legislation?
Potentially, and Donald Trump really trying to walk that very fine line, because a number of his allies in the Senate, like Majority Leader John Thun and Senator Lindsey Graham, are both in favor of, potentially two separate bills. So we're hearing mixed messaging from Trump, but I think he understands that the party may be divided on this, and he wants to keep that air of unity, and he wants to make sure these pieces of policies get passed. Immigration is huge for him. That was arguably his top campaign issue. Extending the Trump tax cuts, for example, energy policy, especially in the wake of this offshore drilling ban from President Biden. So this is of utmost importance for him at this point. It's important for the party to be united, and I think he's sort of trying to signal that to congressional leaders.
What's the essence of the debate over one bill or two bills, kind of pitting the House Republicans versus Senate Republicans?
I think there's a factor of how easy is it to get passed. I think sometimes it's thought to be you get it passed just easily, more quickly with one giant bill, but with two bills you can sort of chop it up and maybe focus on either one at the same time. So I think it's just a means of strategy there.
It's a big test for Thun, the top leader in the Senate. He hasn't always been on the same page as President Trump, and the fact President Trump called him a rhino back in 2021. They seem to have mended their relationship since then, but Thun is vowing to keep the Senate filibuster. He says that the Senate shouldn't override the parliamentarian if he says that certain aspects of their legislation can't be run through reconciliation, could put some limits on how aggressive they can be on things like immigration and border policy. Do you think Thun is eventually on a collision course with Trump as he proceeds with a more aggressive style and some of the more forceful legislation that he wants?
Well, over the weekend on Meet the Press, John Thun said his relationship with Donald Trump has evolved over the past 4 years or so, or number of years that they've worked together or have been in working capacity. Remember, Thun originally endorsed Tim Scott for president in the 2024 presidential primary. So Thun has not always been the first to raise his hand in support of Donald Trump, but he understands that this is Donald Trump's party. At the same time, though, he is a legislator, and you can't go in with this heavy-handed approach that you've seen Donald Trump try to go into when it comes to the House and the Senate. I think the Senate is also a very different animal, whereas the Republican senators aren't necessarily more moderate than Trump, but I would say they're maybe a bit more independent. They don't all have that same MAGA brand, so that makes them a bit more, maybe pre-Trump establishment, if you will. John Thun understands that. John Thun also understands that compromise with Democrats might have to come into play here, and he's keeping that in mind as well.
Thun, a proponent of the two-bill strategy that would allow Trump to get an early initial win and hopefully, from Republican perspectives, build some momentum. Again, Trump initially seemed to be siding with the one big package approach. Now he's kind of opened it back up, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes forward. Speaking of Thun, one of the big challenges for Republicans in the Senate is going to be these confirmation hearings that are set to start happening next week. Thun says the Senate will hold thorough and fair hearings, but he says he's not going to make way for recess appointments that has been discussed if Democrats and some Republicans block any of these appointments. It's interesting, some sources we've been hearing from have said that Democratic Senators Bernie Sanders, John Fetterman could possibly be open to voting for somebody like RFK Jr., but there's also some very controversial nominees, Kash Patel, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard. Which one of the nominees do you think is kind of most in danger of confirmation, and do you think it's kind of if one of them is down, it opens the possibility to others as well?
Yeah, because we saw, obviously, with Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, once he dropped out of the nomination process, it seemed like all of the spotlight went to the others, Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth. Look, I would say before Christmas, it was absolutely Pete Hegseth, but it seems, in talking to Senate Democrats and Senate Democratic sources, Senate Republican sources, Senate Republicans may have rallied around Pete Hegseth to the point where, he has enough votes to be be confirmed. I think there really are questions around Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, around their experience leading these large-scale intelligence organizations. For someone like Tulsi Gabbard, too, as we are seeing the situation in the Middle East really become unpredictable, and her relationship with Syria, she notably went to meet with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad back in 2017. He's not in power anymore, but there's a lot of questions about her own foreign policy stances that she's going to have to answer. So I would imagine that all three of these controversial nominees are going to face, pretty strong headwinds, at least in a hearing, but we'll see if Republicans ultimately, all of them, rally around them.
Let's talk about President Biden. Still 2 weeks left in his presidency. On Sunday, he signed this bipartisan Social Security bill. Then he is making this effort to protect vast areas of offshore land from oil and gas drilling. That's been criticized by the industry. Biden says it's in the name of protecting sensitive ecosystems. Is that effort and others like it that we might see from Biden in the next few weeks just going to be overturned by Trump when he gets into office and possibly the Republican Congress?
Well, it's unclear. On Social Security, Democrats voted very much in favor Republicans voted, Democrats did, but Republicans were much more split on that. So that could be a bit more murky, a bit tricky. But for offshore drilling, that could lead to some pretty big legal fights. Remember, Trump tried to overturn a similar ban on offshore drilling or drilling ban that President Obama had put into effect, but that came up against some roadblocks. So I think we can expect to see maybe some legal fights between a court and President Trump, but it's going to be very difficult for him going forward to overturn a lot of that. That being said, though, this ban doesn't affect where the U.S. gets most of its offshore oil from. Much of the Gulf of Mexico, we're still getting oil from there, and Trump has signed off on regulations on where we can drill from. Florida, for example, much of the East Coast is off limits. So I think we'll continue to hear that rhetoric from him, but I don't know how much he can do really to overturn it.
Yeah, certainly will be some legal fights to come as Trump gets into office. Julia Manchester, really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Drew.
Millions of Americans, including here in the nation's capital, woke up to a winter wonderland Monday morning after a winter storm tore through the Midwest and East Coast, bringing with it mounds of snow and ice. 7 states from New Jersey to Kansas have declared states of emergency, and officials are urging caution. News Nation's Tom Dempsey is on the National Mall with the latest.
Parts of the East Coast could see their heaviest snowfall in decades today, and it's led to 7 different states calling states of emergency, states like New Jersey and Kansas doing so, with around 60 million Americans living in the path of this storm. But this winter weather has really caused a mess in the Midwest in particular, with snow and ice making road conditions almost treacherous at times and bringing lots of different crashes. Missouri emergency crews say at least 600 drivers were stranded over the weekend, and in Kentucky, a state trooper was hurt after his patrol car was hit. State leaders urging folks to stay off the roads today. Millions across the Midwest are shoveling themselves out from record-setting snowfall this morning as this storm heads east. Kansas City saw a foot of snow in 24 hours, with city leaders saying that's the most they've seen there in over 30 years. Louisville, Kentucky, shattering a 115-year-old record with their nearly 8 inches of snow over the weekend. And areas like Philadelphia to Richmond, Virginia are expected to be hit the worst today, with some of the areas getting a foot of snow. And this storm is also bringing heavy winds and freezing cold temperatures. Wind gusts up to 45 miles an hour were recorded across the Midwest over the weekend. And the East Coast is expected to feel temperatures up to 25 degrees below normal. The National Weather Service warning the Northeast will feel that bitter cold for several days after this storm. But it is sure pretty to be out here on the National Mall with the snow continuing to fall here. We've seen people exercising, some people running. We saw one gentleman cross-country skiing here along the National Mall. Very pretty to look at. Fun to be outside when you're walking around, but very dangerous to be out on the roads, with many parts of the East Coast dealing with this winter storm. In Washington, D.C., I'm Tom Dempsey, News Nation.
President Biden is in New Orleans Monday to speak and grieve with the families of the victims in that deadly New Year's attack on Bourbon Street. That attack killed 14 people and injured 30 others when a U.S. Army veteran plowed into a crowd early on January 1st. The driver was later shot and killed in a firefight with police. Later that same day, a Tesla Cybertruck exploded outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas. Investigators say the two incidents are not connected. Biden has pushed back against conspiracy theories surrounding the attack, ensuring people that it was not part of a larger planned attack.
I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process. This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau there resigning on Monday after several years of declining popularity and the abrupt resignation of his finance minister last month. Trudeau says he will remain Prime Minister until a new party leader is chosen. It also comes as President-elect Trump is doubling down on threats to impose massive tariffs on all Canadian and Mexican products if the countries do not stop the flow of migrants and drugs into the United States. Robert Sherman is in Mar-a-Lago with more.
Despite the fact President-elect Trump is not slated to take office for 2 more weeks, already leaving an impact on the geopolitical landscape when it comes to foreign policy. And now big news today with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announcing that he will be stepping down as Prime Minister of Canada. Significant, and puts a pin in these discussions that have taken place between President-elect Donald Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister for weeks, where we've seen President-elect Donald Trump take jabs at Canada, saying that they could become the 51st state. He has threatened tariffs, and that is something that he has doubled down on once again, saying that he wants tariffs with Western trade partners, including Mexico and Canada, to play a big role in bettering the United States. He put this out on Truth Social saying, quote, "We must secure our border, unleash American energy, and renew the Trump tax cuts, which were the largest in history, but we will make it even better with no tax on tips. It will all be made with tariffs and much more from countries that have taken advantage of the U.S. for years." The president-elect was asked about this today. This is what he had to say.
We have a situation with Canada that's very interesting. People at first smiled when I mentioned the concept. We lose $200 billion a year. We don't need their cars. We can make the cars here. We have everything. We have all of the gas and oil and everything that you need in terms of energy. We have more than they do. We have everything. We don't need anything from them.
And when it comes to foreign policy, it's not just Canada and Mexico which are top of mind. You also have the situation in Ukraine. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been emphasizing that he's looking forward to President-elect Donald Trump taking office. He has called him strong. He has called him young at heart and believes that he can bring about peace. But something that the Ukrainian president has said is important to him is that he comes to an agreement with President-elect Donald Trump before they open these negotiations with Russia. Otherwise, he believes that will effectively give Russian President Vladimir Putin a blank check victory. Drew?
Thank you, Robert Sherman. President-elect Trump's legal team is making a last-ditch effort to halt sentencing in his New York hush money case. Today, attorneys urge Judge Juan Merchan to hold off on sentencing on January 10th, which is just 10 days ahead of Trump's inauguration. In other news, legal news, Rudy Giuliani is back in court today over whether he should be held in contempt for defying court orders related to the $146 million defamation judgment against him. Joining me now is the Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schonfeld with more. Zach, attorneys for Trump are urging the judge to hold off on sentencing the president-elect on January 10th. What's their legal argument this time?
Hey, Drew. Trump's attorneys are arguing that this sentencing has to be put on hold as they now appeal 2 recent rulings from Judge Merchan that upheld the jury's guilty verdict and would allow this case to move ahead to sentencing just ahead of the inauguration. Both of these rulings in question have to do with presidential immunity. One has to do with Trump's first term and the fact that he is a former president and gets some protections. The other has to do with that he's about to have a second White House term, arguing that the case has to be dismissed now that he is president-elect. Judge Merchan rejected both of those motions and set the sentencing for Friday, But now, as Trump's lawyers seek to appeal those rulings in New York State Court, they have said, bottom line, this sentencing cannot move forward until those appeals are resolved, which of course would have the practical effect of running out the clock until the inauguration.
Yeah, but what happens if they are successful? If it can be delayed past January 20th, will it effectively be pushed off until Trump leaves office?
There is pretty wide agreement here that, at minimum, once Inauguration Day comes and goes, that this case cannot move forward. Judge Merchan has even seemed to signal that he agrees with that. He warned in this ruling when he set the sentencing, telling Trump's lawyers that if for one reason or another that the sentencing has to be postponed until after January 20th, that he sees it as the most viable option to freeze the case for 4 years and that nothing would happen until he gets out of the White House in 2029. Now, I think it's important to point out that the judge has already signaled that if the sentencing were to move forward, that he is inclined to impose no punishment here. He would give what is instead called an unconditional discharge. So what's really at stake is whether Trump is going to have this label of when he assumes the presidency and it takes that oath of office, whether he will be the first convicted felon to become the sitting president.
President-elect Trump's former attorney, Rudy Giuliani, is back in court today after being grilled in court last week on whether or not he should be held in contempt for defying court orders related to that $146 million defamation judgment against him. What's the latest out of the courtroom today?
Yeah, this is now the second day of this contempt hearing that began on Friday. The first day back on Friday, Giuliani was in person in that New York City courtroom on the stand. Today, he's been permitted to appear virtually via video, but he still is answering questions. Now he is taking questions from his own attorney, trying to push back on these accusations from the election workers that he has been willfully ignoring court orders that have required him to turn over most of his assets. So he's been ordered to give up his New York City apartment, his Mercedes-Benz, signed sports memorabilia, and a whole lot of other items. The election workers say they've gotten some of those assets, but that Giuliani has been refusing to turn over the title for some of these assets and some of these other items. So this proceeding is still going on. We're now seeing Giuliani give his defense. In recent days, he's talked about that he's got all of these different legal proceedings against him. He has criminal charges against him, other defamation cases. He's even had to resort in one pending civil lawsuit against him to be his own lawyer to defend himself. So he has said he's got a lot going on there and that this isn't willfully disregarding the court's orders. But still no decision yet from the judge on whether he will be found in contempt of court, and if so, what the sanctions would be.
And Giuliani is also facing a second contempt proceeding in Washington, D.C. What do we know about that hearing and what's at stake in that case?
Yeah, this one is still between Rudy Giuliani and these Georgia election workers, but it is over a bit of a different matter. So the one in New York that we were just talking about, that has to do with, accusations that he has been turning over the assets that he's been required to. The one that's scheduled to take place in Washington, D.C. on Friday is over accusations that he's been continuing to make false and defamatory statements about these election workers. The same false claims of mass election fraud in 2020 over the Ruby Freeman and Shane Moss's work in Atlanta on election night. So they, have asked the judge in Washington, D.C., who originally oversaw this $146 million defamation trial, to hold him in contempt and to effectively try to stop him from continuing to make these false statements.
And today marks the 4th anniversary of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Prosecutors have charged more than 1,500 defendants with crimes tied to January 6th. But now, with Trump 2 weeks away from taking power, what would it look like if the president-elect follows through with his promises to pardon those individuals?
This really does seem like the beginning of the end for what has turned into one of the largest criminal investigations by federal prosecutors in the nation's history. Trump has promised during the campaign and after his election to pardon these January 6th defendants. It's still unclear at this point about whether that pardon will be a blanket pardon to everyone who has been charged in connection with the Capitol riot, or whether it will be tailored in some way, shape, or form. But by and large, it seems that these cases are going to come to an end. Ever since Trump won the election, we've seen a series of motions from various defendants seeking to delay their cases and put them on hold until Trump takes office. We've actually even seen some requests for some of the defendants to attend his inauguration. And just today, on this 4-year anniversary story of the January 6th Capitol attack. A letter was sent to Trump's team today from a lawyer for former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio. He was one of the most prominent cases of these January 6th trials. He was sentenced to quite significant prison time. He was not in Washington, D.C. itself on January 6th, but was accused of helping the Proud Boys organize the Capitol riot. So really now we're just seeing this increasing drip of defendants, seeking to put their cases on hold as they are now hoping that Trump follows through on his promise and brings these cases to an end.
All right, that's all I got for you. Thank you, Zach Schonfeld.
Thanks, Drew.
Japanese company Nippon Steel fighting back after President Biden blocked its acquisition of U.S. Steel. Nippon and U.S. Steel are now suing the Biden administration to move forward with their merger. The new lawsuit alleges Biden blocked the merger for political reasons, saying interfering gained him favor with the United Steelworkers Union. The companies also allege in a separate lawsuit that the Steelworkers Union illegally colluded with a Cleveland-based company to tank the deal. The USW called the allegations in both suits baseless. Meantime, President Biden said last week that his decision was due to national security concerns. Many lawmakers, as well as President-elect Trump, have also opposed the merger. Former President Jimmy Carter's 6-day state funeral began on Saturday as his family accompanied his hearse through his hometown of Plains, Georgia. After a stop at his family farm, the motorcade made its way to the Carter Center in Atlanta, where the late president currently lies in repose until tomorrow morning. Next Star Nation's Archit Seshadri has the latest from Atlanta, where the public continues to pay their respects.
For those who knew former President Jimmy Carter, they say he was someone who always gave back to his community. That's exactly why he set up the Carter Center back in the 1980s here in Atlanta that still continues to thrive here today, focusing on restoring elections, monitoring diseases around the world, and trying to eradicate things like river blindness and guinea worm, as well as finding ways to restore peace and democracy.
President Carter considered the Carter Center a home away from home. For 40 years, he worked here 1 week every month and lived here, literally in a Murphy bed.
The Atlanta-based nonprofit receives donations and endowments from the government and is now allowing one final goodbye for its founder, Jimmy Carter.
We really wanted to create something that was like a mini Camp David, a place where people could come and talk about conflict resolution, talk about human rights, bring global health to the center of people's attention. And so in creating the Carter Center, it did just that. We're able to have partnerships with Emory University and CDC and so many others.
For the past week, people have been dropping off tributes here in Atlanta, dropping off things like candles, flowers, peanuts, and other ways to pay their respects for the former president.
The flowers, the notes, the handwritten notes, the chalkboard that's been put up, people just want everybody to know that he meant something to them. And we've heard these great stories, whether he was shaking someone's hand on a plane or whether somebody knew somebody who no longer has a blinding eye disease because of his work.
The former 39th president and his wife, Rosalind, started the center after his one term in the White House, and it's improved the quality of lives for people in more than 80 countries.
All of those things are what he spent 40 years building. And so now we have a staff who have trained under him, who have that expertise, and for us, that's what we will carry on. His North Star was both global health and peace, and we will continue working in those two areas because that's what he wanted us to do.
Those who knew Jimmy Carter say he was a Southerner at heart, enjoyed his brisket, and loved his wife's strawberry shortcake. He enjoyed meeting people and was a good listener, and authored more than 30 books.
Being down in Plains was like visiting any grandparent's home. You had kind of the chocolate chip cookies from Chips Ahoy put out for you, but you talked about everything around the world that was happening.
The Carter Center CEO says a few words to describe President Carter include a moral compass, integrity, sincerity mixed with stubbornness, but a well-rounded person who lived his values. Reporting in Atlanta, Archit Seshadri, Atlanta Bureau Chief.
President Carter's family will travel with his body to Washington tomorrow, while he will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol through Thursday morning. The national funeral service will take place at 10 a.m. on Thursday at the Washington National Cathedral. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.